the Linn drum, well, this is the man.
And I'm going to, unfortunately, be doing no drums. And by the way, I don't listen to any drum machine music. So yeah, I'm Roger Linn, and I'm normally associated with drum machines, or in this past decade with guitar processing, rhythmic guitar processing. I have a product called Adrenaline that does that for guitar. But the thing that I'm really most passionate about is new human interfaces for music. And in fact, David and I and a few other friends, we meet every Thursday morning for breakfast, and we hyper ourselves into a frenzy talking about this sort of stuff. It's really a great subject, and so we'll be talking about that tonight. So if you don't know, this is David Wessel, who is the director here of CNMAT, the Center for New Music and Audio Technologies. And a little known secret is he's a foodie. He's always talking about, what you just bought volumes of cookbooks?
Yeah, I'm the proud owner of the 6-volume, 2,400 some odd page book by Nathan Marigold called Modernist Cooking.
Yeah, he buys a cookbook written by a Microsoft early founder, like Nathan Marigold. And then on this side is a gentleman named Garrett Bevan, and he's a representative from the Eigenharp company that makes this wonderful instrument we've seen called Eigenharp. And he's actually not really a demonstrator. He does the demonstrations, but he's actually one of the creators. He's one of the senior software engineers to develop the software for the Eigenharp. So let's give it up. And very, very good players as well. It's a wonderful company, everyone there, including Neil McDougall here, who's also a representative of the company. Give him a little applause. But they've come here from England, and they're all very creative musicians. It's a very creative group of people that are involved in the making of this wonderful, unique, and really extraordinary instrument. So we're very, very, very pleased and very proud to have them here. And it's a small group of us, small companies that are trying to make, or small organizations that are trying to make these new instruments. And the wonderful thing is that many of us know each other, and we I think the reason we're trying to do this together is that we all feel that a rising tide floats all boats. So we're trying to raise interest in the topic, as I was saying earlier, and get more people to cross that barrier of between statements like instruments should be made of wood and brass, and that's the only way they should be.
And the rest are controllers.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, or using musical control. That's bad. And so by stimulating an interest in this topic and debate, I think we're doing a good job, and hopefully all of you will come away with some new ideas and talk to your friends about this sort of stuff and spread the word about it. So let me talk a little bit about what the focus of the instruments tonight is. And I was saying this earlier, is that traditional instruments, the ones that made of wood and brass and such, have given us wonderful musical performances for centuries, and we've grown to love these sounds and these instruments. And I think one of the reasons that makes these instruments so compelling is that they really take advantage of the very subtle gestures of the fingers. For example, if you play a violin and when you're bowing it, you're actually doing very, very subtle movements. If you're a great violinist, or a great guitarist, or a great clarinetist, or any good solo instrument. And that's because there's this wonderful surface of the instrument that is very tightly coupled to the sound generator. But then you enter about the 60s or 70s, and electronic synthesis took over this. And so the best way to interface with the human body was through a musical keyboard, black and white keyboard. But that took away a lot of that expression. And in fact, the piano or the organ was great about playing many notes at once, but it really lost that beautiful expressiveness of the instrument that could change its timbre in very complex ways over time, as a violin does, or clarinet, the other aforementioned instruments. So in electronic synthesis, we have an era now where you've got tremendous power in synthesis and the ability to create wonderful sounds, but they're not nearly as expressive as these traditional instruments. And so we're right now at this tipping point where there are instruments starting to emerge, and we're showing 3 of them tonight. Instruments where the creators have focused on capturing those subtle gestures of the human fingers to be able to create very, very highly expressive instruments that are also polyphonic, can play chords. And until this time, there really haven't been any examples of that. If you wanted an expressive instrument, it was 1 note at a time, or perhaps the bowed instrument 2 notes at a time. And if you wanted to play chords, you had to play an instrument whose expression came from chords and playing many notes at once, as the piano does. The piano is very expressive in its own way, but you can't wiggle the keys, and you can't change the timbre over time. It's always one on one. And so each of the instruments that we'll be showing you tonight have the ability to, for each note you're playing, or each sound you're creating, to be able to sense the pressure of the finger and the X-Y direction, the X direction, which is for used often for pitch, and the Y direction. So you've actually got 3 different directions that are being sensed in real time, and get these instruments very fast. But the other beauty of it is that for every finger that's being sensed at these 3 directions, you can do this for every finger simultaneously and polyphonically. And so this is really the first. There haven't been instruments that have done this to this degree, or actually at all, until very, very recently. So to give you an idea of what that sounds like, what I'd like to do is give you a brief snippet of some of the sounds of the instrument. So would you like to start off with something here?
Sure. So as Roger says, I'm a software developer, and even though I'm playing the Eigenharp, I've only been able to play it for a year, because it only exists for a year, right? So I'm doing my best to try to demonstrate little snippets and bits and pieces, right? So if I screw up, then you know it's because I've just been playing it for a year. So this first little snippet is just to show you how you can combine different controls. So I'm going to try to play a little piece on a physical model of a cello, where I'll be using the strip controller here at the bottom to bow, and then use the keys here as strings that run across the neck of the instrument as actual strings across the row. So as I move my fingers upwards, it will detect that it's the same string, and it will not play the notes that are being played upwards of the string, because when the finger downwards kind of blocks the vibration. And then I'll do some polyphonic vibrato and stuff like that. Let's see if this goes up. Alternatively, I'd like to show another way of controlling this. So, just to show that it's actually preference is very important in how you interact with these instruments. So yesterday when we were doing the demos, and then afterwards, someone who is actually a cello player, he found it uncomfortable because as you play the cello, you actually play downwards, right? Your bow is lower, right? So putting his hand to the side didn't feel comfortable for him. And then it actually dawned on me why we developed this other way of controlling this. So you could actually use the key down here to bow. And this is possible because these keys are so high resolution and so detailed that just merely brushing over it and detecting the slight little variations of inclinations is possible to detect a bowing motion.
So the key doesn't move?
The key moves.
It doesn't move.
So you feel it move in all directions. If you see it this way, you can see that it actually moves.
Okay.
But just brushing over it is sufficient to detect movement on these keys. Which is, as a musician, something that I like a lot, because I suffer from tendinitis on my thumb from playing the electric guitar and the acoustic guitar, and I suffer from wrist pain from trying to play the piano and typing too much on the keyboard. And this is so light touch that you can really just brush it, and as you said it so nicely earlier, you know, caress, in this case the keys, and in your case the pads, and it really makes it very intimate, I think, you know, which is a very nice aspect of this high resolution control. Let's enjoy that.
Okay, now I'm going to talk about an instrument that I've created with my wife Ingrid back there. And I don't know if you know my other talk, but I always manage to get our last name in the product name. So instead of an instrument, we call this the LinnStrument. And so what this is I've got a kind of a input crack pad surface here. It's multi-touch, but it also senses pressure. Hey. It senses the pressure at any point along it polyphonically. And I've got it divided up into a series of musical notes. That's not unlike a guitar. I've got rows of chromatics. And then the rows are offset by fourths. Which is like a guitar. Now if I wanted to, I could tune these 6 middle strings just like a guitar. E, A, D, G, B, and E. But instead I actually like it being tuned in intervals of all fourths, which is kind of like taking guitar and tuning the B and the high E strings up a half step each, and then you get an even interval. And the beauty of that is it makes the layout of the note selection interface what's called isomorphic. In other words, I can use one gesture for a given chord regardless of the key I'm using. Now compare that to a guitar. You've got that pesky third interval between the B and the E, B and the G strings. And that means that depending on which strings you're using, you have to use a different fingering. Well, we've all learned that, guitar players. I'm a guitar player, and we're used to it. But wouldn't it be nice if we didn't have to? A popular guitar player named Pat Martino uses fourths tuning on guitar, and he says he finds it so much easier. He can't imagine doing complex jazz pieces, again, using standard guitar tuning. Take another example, the piano. Basically, the piano and the guitar are the only instruments. Hey, Don, welcome. Talk about instrument developer. It's on movement, ladies and gentlemen. Talk about interchangeable.
Sneak in quietly.
You didn't like it. But then take the piano. Of course, probably the most popular instrument now is with synthesizers. But if you want to play a major triad, for example, you have to learn 12 different fingerings, one for each key, because you can't just slide it off the keyboard. So one of the common goals of many people that are creating new musical layouts, whether it's the one I've chosen or the one that's being used on the Eigenharp, or David's is a little bit different because he's not really intending the instrument specifically for pitch space, but he can do pitch space with it. But one of the goals of many of the different note layouts is to make it isomorphic, unlike the instruments that have been developed so far. So at any rate, what I've got in this is I've got this note layout of chromatics offset by fourths, and it's sensitive to 3 dimensions. I've got pressure, I've got pitch, and then I have a 3rd dimension of timbre. So my forward backward position within each note cell is controlling the timbre of the sound. But I put those all together, and it makes it very expressive. So I'll perform a piece on this in which I'm doing that sort of expression, but I'm also playing polyphonically. And keep in mind that what you're hearing, and what you're hearing right now, is an extraordinarily simple synthesizer works. All it is a pulse oscillator and a low-pass filter for each note, and that's it. There's a little reverb on it. But it shows you what you can do when you can focus now on the controller as opposed to only on the synthesis. So what I'm going to play is Bach's Air on a G string, or a very simplified arrangement of it that I can actually figure out. And I'll say the reason I chose this is because did everyone here know of Max Matthews? Well, you probably know that he passed away just a week or so ago. And he used to use a box air on a G-string as a demonstration for his instrument, the radio baton. And so in honor of Max, I tried to work up a simple arrangement of that piece, and I'll do that now. Unfortunately, you can't see it, I guess, very well, but I'll try my best.
That you could sense the pressure separately in different regions of the surface. And then, in addition to that, there were things that behaved like a one-dimensional slider-like mechanism. So it was a flat surface, and I found it to be an extremely expressive instrument. Don has a new version of it coming out sometime soon, I think. Well, anyway, this was my answer to the next step, which was to have an array of touch-sensitive surfaces, and sort of looking for the right material, I found these track pads that were made by Interlin, and they're resistive in character and they're sensitive to pressure. These track pads were used at one time in the Sony Vaio computer, and they're rare in the sense that they're pressure sensitive. Well, when we got them, the circuits that were recommended to scan them weren't quite fast enough. We wanted to really scan them at a high rate and so on. So this is the second series of prototypes, but we're actually, this is going to maybe shock some of you or make you think. We thought at first that we would take a look at what was going on in the pressure and position. Each one of them is sensitive to X and Y and Z. There are 32 of them. And we maybe send it using open sound control or some asynchronous protocol, which you're doing, and I'm sure the Eigenharp does as well. But we said, let's see what happens if we turn the gesture data into something that looks like audio data, signals, as opposed to discrete asynchronous events. So we sampled the gestures at actually 1/8 the audio rate, which is pretty high. It was up in about 7 kilohertz or so, or 6, depending on what the overall audio sample. Then we upsampled them to the audio rate. And so we end up sending 96 channels of audio data over Ethernet to Macintosh where the synthesis is done. Now you'd think that would bog down the machine, but it doesn't. It's pretty easy. We're able to, here we have 133 channels of audio for this loudspeaker system. I'm sending 96 channels. We have other systems that use as many as 500 independent channels. So I guess one of the things I'd like to push, if those of you who are thinking about these instruments for building instruments of your own, is that don't shy away from actually just treating the gestural data as if it was audio. And then you give the user of the instrument a direct coupling with the sound. There's no jitter and so on that you get from the discrete event. So that's kind of one point I want to make. And then the other one is, I mean, Roger said it over and again, it's clearly demonstrated with these other instruments. It's really, pressure is so important, and it's just hard for me to imagine that someone would build a new instrument in which you couldn't control dynamics, but it's happening all the time. As a matter of fact, if you go to one of these conferences on new instruments for new interfaces for musical expression, they have this conference called 9. The majority of the interfaces that people produce don't give the user control over dynamics, which I think is great. Now, so I'm going to play a little bit, and then now I have the advantage of this wonderful loudspeaker too, and I'm not using any of the other loudspeakers in the room, just this one. So let me just say a bit about this thing, and then I'll say more about it later. I mean, when we're thinking about, well, first of all, let me just say that here at CNMAT, we're really interested in the whole chain, from the controller side of things, the software that generates the sound, synthesis, and so on, and then finally rendering engines that diffuse the sound in ways that maybe are quite different. We do know, for example, that traditional acoustic instruments have very dynamic radiation patterns. They're always changing. A saxophone, for example, when all the keypads are closed, the sound comes out of the bell. When you open up the keys along the side, the sound is being diffused quite differently. Likewise, as you move across the strings of a violin, the diffusion changes also very dramatically, and then the musicians are moving. So normal loudspeakers that we have, like here, tend to homogenize the spatiality of this kind of dynamism that you would have in the radiation pattern. So we wanted to do something about simulating that, and so or providing richness, that is, radiation patterns that were very changing dramatically. And here what I'm doing is I have 8 different beams that are shown on this screen, and I assign one of my 8 channels to each of the beams.
Can everybody see that?
Yeah.
And there I thought it was just an orchid.
No. Yeah. Yeah. Right. And so let me perform a little bit for you, and I'll explain some of these. sort of conductor-like perspective. So like up here, on each of these pads, I have 100 oscillators per finger, actually. So I have actually 800 sitting up here on the top row. And I'm disposing them in different kinds of structures. And I'd be happy to talk later about the details of how this works, but let me just say that I was very interested in these kind of massive sound structures. And as I move in the space, I'm kind of moving in a space of different kinds of large cluster-like sounds. And so I actually have both dimensions operating, and of course the Z dimension or the pressure dimension connects to dynamics. And you know, I've been thinking a lot about this problem of performing on instruments of this sort. You know, you can change the mapping. I mean, here I have some granular style synthesis down here. And God, how do my gestures relate to that? And then here's this percussion stuff. So, I mean, like every pad could have a different kind of compositional processor or algorithmic thing that would be generating things. So how in the world do you somehow appreciate what the performer's doing by watching him? It would seem horribly confusing. But if there's some, my feeling is that if you can show force, if you can show the public that you're actually applying more pressure or more efforts going into the performance, somehow you're connecting in a way that nobody with a mouse and a standard laptop will be able to do, unless of course they fake it. There's a lot of that going on. So being able to convey intention and force, I think, and to show it in some ways, I think is a critical feature that sometimes we neglect, and I think it carries a strong message.
Yeah, very much so. In fact, it's interesting because we've seen a lot of instruments come out, particularly in kind of the DJ world, that are based on sequencing. Does everybody know about the Yamaha Tenorion?
Yeah, that's an example. Yeah.
Well, it's funny, it's all on-off switches.
Right.
We kind of talked about it. And Dave was far too kind to make criticisms of other person's instrument, but I call it the Tenorion on-off. Because that's all it does. It just turns things on and off. And to me, it just misses so much of music. And as I say, David loves to talk about gestures or about caressing an instrument, or what was the other phrase you used?
Well, control intimacy. I mean,
Control
having a
intimacy,
very
yeah.
tight control loop here. I mean, like
And for me,
on it.
to me, in my experience, and of course, it's the wonderful thing is that everybody has a different view of this, and that's what makes it so fascinating. But some of the music that I've found that moved me the most in my life has been music played on an instrument in that place that's just above silence, and I call it between silence and whispers, where there's so much tonal variation at that level, and someone who can play that has such an extraordinary level of control. And that's the sort of thing I think we're all trying to do, is to be able to do that. One thing I'd like to say also about what David was talking about scanning the instrument, scanning the input surface at audio rates, it's a wonderful concept. I don't actually do that. This instrument right now, which is just very primitive prototype, only scans at about 120 hertz, whereas David's scans at nearly 8 kilohertz, and the Eigenharp scans at 2,000 hertz. 8 kilohertz, 2 kilohertz, and that's, once again, it's for each of the 3 dimensions simultaneously for all the fingers that are playing it. So it's a tremendous amount of data. But when you think about it, take the example of a drum, like a conga drum, or any sort of a drum head stretched over a body, a wooden body. When a conga player, for example, plays one of these drums, he has so many gestures. He'll tap it, or he'll do the tone of the drum by striking on the end. And what a drum is basically is some sort of an excitation at your hand, and then a resonant surface, the skin that's being stretched, so it resonates over this tube, which enhances the resonance of it. But the conga player will rub his thumb over it, get it to vibrate, and yet it's just this one resonant tube, and we've heard so many instruments, or so many sounds come out of any drum, any hand-played drum. And so that's the sort of thing that you're able to do when you are actually able to get the control surface to these standard audio rates. You can tap it with your fingernail and it sounds different than if you tap it with your finger. You can roll your thumb across it. You can do all kinds of things and discover those gestures, these new gestures that nobody really knows yet with these instruments. And I know as a guitar player I can sort of scrape the pick against the string, and if I play it back here it sounds different from that. I can mute it with my palm of my hand a little bit. These are all the gestures that I've become accustomed to. There's some guitar players that by using their fingers around the pick, are able to get different harmonics just by playing. And this is what makes it interesting, is that constant variation. And this is what I think is so fascinating about the ability to capture so much of the subtle gestures of the human body.
Yeah, before I forget, I just want to acknowledge a couple of the people who really helped a tremendous amount in bringing this concept to life. One is Adrian Freed, he might be in the room.
Yeah.
One of the big brains around here, and not only he makes things, and that's what's we like to make things here, real gadgets and so on and so.
And also instrumental in OSC.
And I was going to say that Adrian is, in some sense, he's the origin of open sound control. And a lot of us have worked on it, Matt Wright and so on, and others. But watch out, there's some new stuff that's just been sent out on OSC that's really quite extraordinary. The way of new set of practices for programming that we're very excited about, that Adrian is the author of. The other person who is really important is Remus Avazinius, who is in our parallel computing lab right now, but he worked for us in a number of years. He's been involved in using field programmable gate arrays, or FPGAs, and that's what we have here for massaging the data and so on. And we have a little Linux computer on the interface itself. Just for another word or two about the way this thing works, it's Ethernet. Back already in the mid-90s, we decided to go with Ethernet as the way to communicate from an instrument, from a controller to the machine. Now the reason for that was that was the most ubiquitous I/O port on any laptop that was around at the time. I mean, we didn't have USB 2 and FireWire was just sort of, well, it was coming onto the scene and so on. But Ethernet's been very, very good for us, and now I think we'll see that it will carry us long into the future with the new standard, which is called AVB, or the Audio Video Bridge. I think we'll see it take over in some sense. So Ethernet was important. Another thing was we wanted to, the nice thing about Ethernet is you can send the sound back out. So I actually I'm doing the synthesis and all the control and everything inside of a Maximus P-pad. And then I'm sending the sound back out over Ethernet to this device. And then I plug in an optical cable where I go to the converter. But I've done a number of gigs recently where I don't have to put the optical into my own converters. I just go to the desk at the gig or in the studio. I just plug in the optical right away. So in some sense, it's the computer, and this is an entire system with the audio interface and everything complete. We didn't really forget about MIDI. We have MIDI in only. And that MIDI data is then multiplexed. If you wanted to put a keyboard or a slider bank or some other MIDI gear, you could actually have it multiplexed into the stream of data that goes over Ethernet to the computer. So I think that's another thing. There's some other analog I/O available here as well. And also you can run 8 channels of audio through the interface as well using LiPi. So it's fairly flexible and fairly portable and rather quickly set up. And the next version of this will be certainly something we can carry on.
Carry on an airplane.
Yes. Right now, I'm obliged to check it, and it's a panic, you know.
Yeah.
You're there at the baggage claim, and it doesn't come out. This happened to me the last time I went out to the Ark. I was just waiting there, no bag, nothing, and then finally it showed up, the last one.
Dave and I are in kind of the same boat. He has the one prototype of that. And this one I have here, actually I didn't make this. This was created by a short-lived company called Touchco that was a couple of very bright guys from NYU. And I had already been talking to them about using their technology in a musical instrument. And then Amazon bought them and shut them down and took them off the market. And so this is the only, I got this one prototype from them. It's the only one I have, and I guard it with my life.
Yeah.
And fortunately, it fits in the overhead bin, so I can always take it. But otherwise, I'd be up shit's creek, as they say, if this got damaged. So I be very careful.
I also would like to acknowledge Meyer Sound, and they've helped us immensely in getting this speaker system put together. And Andy Schmieder, who's here, that does the beam farming, and it turns out to be a fairly complicated piece of software. It uses what are called spherical harmonic representation of the.
Actually, I don't know if you saw Perrin's here.
Perrin Meyer's here.
Okay, Meyer Sound.
Yes, Meyer Sound. And so the software here, from a mathematical perspective, is fairly sophisticated, and you can see that we have we have a tweeter array on top, 120 channels there, are all separate. A mid-range driver that has 12 drivers in it, and then a subwoofer, so that's 133 altogether. And
One point that you said before, actually each of these triangles has 6 speakers in it, so you've got 120 up there. Inside this block, there are 120 40-watt amplifiers.
that's right.
That's the
Oh, this thing, we could blow you up.
Yeah.
So, but in a way, I mean, the kind of future that I'm imagining is that I would like to go out, in some sense, and play with people in a kind of chamber music-like setting, where they wouldn't have to be amplified. I would have a smaller, more portable version of this kind of radiation pattern controlled loudspeaker and my instrument, and I think it'd be a nice way to interact with other musicians as well. So that aspect is important. We found a number of other uses for this speaker in terms of doing, in particular, acoustical measurements and probing halls and that sort of thing, and that's a whole other story. But, well, Roger, I mean, I'm yakking on here about things. I think, you know, there's an obsession now with having graphics on your interface, you know, like everybody's saying, well, the iPad is it, you know, we're just gonna, but again, we're suffering there with a poor system for actually measuring the pressure or how much force is being applied to it. So it's something. Now I haven't myself worried too much about having the display. I don't look at my instrument when I'm playing it. I do. I mean, I look at kind of. I don't need to look at it. I'd rather not worry about having a screen underneath and that sort of thing. But it is something that a lot of people want. And
I think this is something people want, but once they start using it, then they realize that they're glued to their iPad, and then any meaningful graphic will be obscured by your hands. This is something I also noticed. So you start, okay, let's put the notes there, and then you put your hands, okay, well, I can't see the note names anymore, so let's move them up, and then when I slide upwards, I can't see them anymore. So it's annoying. And as you say, as a musician, you look at your instruments, but it's mainly to look for the connection with your instruments. You don't look at it to make sure that you're playing the right notes.
that's right.
Because when you start performing, you want to start connecting with your audience, right? And this is not possible on a touch-based device that requires you to have constant visual contact with it. Because it's not your touch that will give you the performance, it will be your eyes. And there's also a disconnect, I think, because, I don't know, you will have a latency, right? Your eyes will recognize something that you want to do, and then your finger will execute it, which is totally different than when you feel with your finger on the each of these different devices exactly what is going on.
Yeah, and you maybe as a picture is worth 1,000 words, maybe we could make some more sounds that would be worth 10,000 words.
Right.
Yeah,
I feel very small compared to this.
Yeah, I got one speaker. Actually, the woman here had a question.
I'm just looking at the, is that a mouthpiece that's on it?
This is a mouthpiece, yeah.
Yeah, why don't you demonstrate some of the various things on that?
Talk about the technology a little bit.
Yeah, too.
Yeah, well, I'm not an engineer, so I'm talking here as a musician, maybe. So different aspects of the Eigenharp are that you've got 120 keys that are three-dimensional, so they move in up, down, lateral, and pressure continuously. And multi-monophonic, I like that term that you used yesterday, the hacking uses for it.
Yeah,
I think it's a good word, because polyphonically you start thinking about the piano and percussion-based polyphonic sounds that are kind of triggered at once, while these are independent streams of data that carry all the monophonic performance information simultaneously. Right? So, but you can still do percussive model with it also. Then you've got this mouthpiece here, which is quite interesting actually, because it's actually one of the most difficult pieces apparently I learned afterwards to create, because spit seems to be an extremely difficult thing to control. And we're still struggling with it, right? Some people, like for example, I've got very acid spit. Actually, when I was a kid, I had problems with my teeth, and none of the bridges actually stuck. My spit just disintegrated everything.
That's
So,
disgusting.
yeah, I know. But the problem is, I find that I have problems with the earlier versions of our breath pipe. So we've got a new version now, but it started corroding the interiors, and we fixed it afterwards. But so one of the things that's nice though is that the spit problem is solved, because if you see this mouthpiece, you can see it. Actually, when the air goes in, there is a main area in the center, and if you come up later, you'll see there are two little holes to the sides. So the airflow is separated from the beginning, and your spit will go through the center together with the main airflow, and actually go all the way down the instrument through a little hole at the bottom. And if you've got a lot of spit, it will just drip on the floor and not on your shirt, which is what a lot of wind instrument plays. I think what's it called? It's another electronic wind instrument.
Was the Kai had made the
Yeah.
EV, and Niall Steiner had made
Yeah.
the stylophone.
They drift, so it's
And Yamaha. But it's funny you talked about that problem in the Yamaha DX7 in the 80s. They had a wind controller, and they were trying to measure the velocity of wind that passes through, not just the pressure. And they had that same problem. You'd see somebody really getting very passionate in their performance. You'd see the spit dripping down the side.
And so yeah, it's very nicely constructed, because you've got this tube in the middle that separates the airflows, and the pressure is being measured here, while the air actually flows through the whole instrument.
One thing I'm inclined to say is this is a great example of the extraordinary level of design creativity that has gone into this instrument in all its phases. The construction of the design and the construction of the keys, and just the fit and finish of this thing, the craftsmanship is just beautiful. And it's something that, by the way, afterwards, we're going to invite you up to try out these instruments, touch and feel them, and you'll get the true sense of how great this instrument is.
And so then here, we've got, this is the breath pipe, and then you've got a microphone input here that you can connect to a DPA microphone with a very nice microphone preamp, actually. And you can control that either through 3 effects or with the keyboard, and you can kind of set up whatever you want. If you want to do vocoding, or I come from a very traditional singer-songwriter background, playing acoustic guitar, steel string, and singing songs. And this is one of the things that actually attracted me most to the Eigenharp Alpha, because I'm self-contained, right? So if I want to play on stage, I don't have to worry about my microphone stand, and I've got everything with me, because, and I don't have my in-ears plugged in now. At the back here, you've got a headphone output. So like in your instruments, audio goes through to the laptop that actually massages all of the raw information at 2 kilohertz, 10-bit for each data stream, but then sends audio back so that you can hear it from longer. And then you can select which audio interface you use to go out to the front of the house. So, so you're very nicely self-contained. This is also one of the aspects of the Eigenharp, I think you can clearly see, is that it's for someone that wants to play on stage, it's to stand up, it's to be able to move around, it's to be able to go to an audience, to engage while you're playing. So I talked briefly about the 120 keys here. Then you've got another set of keys here that are actually exactly the same technology, but they're just larger. So they're easier to hit if you want to play percussive ones, or if you want to do things like I showed before, which is the bowing here, and I'll do another demo later where you actually play it as guitar strings. What else is there to say? Then yes, you've got two strip controllers here, which are resistance based. So we've got one on this side and one on that side, also hidden beneath a nice leather finish, which makes it very nice to play because you've got a smooth surface that feels very natural to touch. And then this is another aspect that I think that is often forgotten when thinking about instruments, and that is the physical aspect of it. Because I'm a tall guy, and I've got quite a bit of force, so I have no problem carrying this. Right? It's not extremely heavy, it's about as heavy as a Gibson, but a lot of people have trouble carrying a Gibson. Right? So it would be a shame to not be able to play it just because it weighs a lot. And so we thought about different ways of using it. So you can slide out a spike, and if you'd like to, you could either, so some people actually that are short, they just play it standing up like this, right? So, or you can sit down in a chair and play it like a cello. So there are different ways to physically embrace the Eigenharp, which I think is important for an instrument.
Yes.
Because everyone has its preferences, yes?
I'm curious about the mapping of the grid. I came in a little late,
Yeah.
but maybe you mentioned that.
I haven't mentioned it yet.
Oh, okay.
So that is also a very interesting question because you brought it up yesterday. I think that this is research that is still going on, right? Because everyone has its preferences, and we're still going towards what would be a nice thing that works for everyone. But actually, I personally don't think that it exists. A nice layout that works for everyone. So, but when you start up the Eigenharp Alpha and you've never done anything with it, the way it will be configured is that you've got rows that go across the playing surface like this. We call them courses. And they're offset by 4 keys. So it goes up like this. 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Right? And then it does the same by repeating it along this axis. So this key and this key will be the same. Right? So now, on top of that, you lay out a scale. So the standard way it starts up, it will be very easy for someone that wants to try it out. It will be the C major scale. Right? So this will be a 5th as you press it down, which makes it easy for people to play power chords and to do some goofy stuff, right? So you just press 2 fingers down and you can start walking out. And then you can start switching scales on the fly, so I'm not sure what I've got set up here. So I've got just scale set up here, and then I can, on the fly, say this was a major scale. You say, well, this becomes or can change the root of it on the fly. So this is really something that you will grow accustomed to as you explore the instrument. And we've seen that actually people, interestingly, after they've been using it for a week, they start being very creative about how they want to map out these notes and how they want to orient things across this surface, this grid of 3D keys. And there are people that have been arranging it like a guitar because they don't want to learn anything else, right? People that come from a cello background that have arranged it as a cello, and other people that come from a wind instrument background and they want to play it the opposite way. They want to play it from down upwards instead of this way around. And so we've got a whole bunch of setups there that people are sharing in forums, and it's very organic. So I actually don't think there is one way that will work for everyone. And we've got DJs that use the Pico. They just look for something that they can easily control live with.
They're Ableton Live, you mean?
Yeah. Yes.
If you aren't aware, there's actually 3 models of the Eigenharp. He's showing the Eigenharp Alpha, which is the high-end product. But this is their Tau, which is about half the price, isn't it?
This is half the price, and it's got most of the same features. It's just got a little bit less keys at the top here. We replaced some of the... So, as you see, I'm actually using keys here to switch instruments and to switch scales, right? Which is kind of a shame because you're doing just on-off actions with very expressive keys, right? But you can change that if you want to. Some people have done that already. So to make it cheaper and actually still provide this functionality, we replace some of the keys with these keys here, which makes it cheaper. So these are just on-off switches. And then, I don't know how many keys are on the top, do you remember? Yeah. 80 or something?
A lot.
Yeah.
80. So it's basically just 4 rows instead of 5. So you got 1 row less. You got the same percussion keys at the bottom. And then you've got a headphone output at the back here, and 1 strip controller at the back.
Instead of 2.
And you don't have a microphone input, and here you've got a breath pipe that goes in here. You got it with? So, and this comes in different finishes also. So this is a breath pipe.
I just briefly shown the Pico, but I'd like to get some sounds going too.
Yeah.
The
So
smaller model.
This is actually the one that I started out with. This one.
Oh, wow.
I love this one personally because I just put it in my backpack and I don't have to check it in. Because I'm also terrified. I had to check it in for the first time this time and I was like, ah. And this makes you realize actually how little you need to be expressive.
Yes.
It's got 18 keys, but it's the same kind of keys. They're also just 3D keys. And it also,
It's exactly the same expressive
Yeah,
keys
exactly
as
the
on
same
the high-end model, but just fewer rows.
but it also made me realize, it's something I never actually thought about, which is a complexity that a lot of musicians, well, wind instrument players don't have a complexity that I come from a guitar background, a little bit of piano, is the complexity of moving your hands across the surface and having this connected to all your joints and having to coordinate that actually makes playing an instrument immensely more difficult, because you always have to be aware of where you will actually position your entire arm. And on the Pico you don't have this problem because you've got these 2 thumb hooks on the back that you can shift around based on how your hands are constructed, so they can put your thumbs in there, and then basically your fingers fall on the right spots, and you never move your hands, you just play with your fingers. And that actually I think is one of the main parts why people are picking this up in a couple of days, because their fingers just stay in the same location. And then you can attach a strap to the back here. So I bought one myself. So I bought a saxophone strap because it's padded and easier to carry around. You can strap into it. Enough of that. Let me see if I can play something else. Yeah, just been there and here and change everything. So this this little demo is using, actually, we're going out to Native Instruments Contact Sampler audio unit, where I'm actually abusing MIDI by using the 16 channels of MIDI as a polyphony, so that I can have individual pitch for each channel. But I only set up 4 in this patch. And I'm using Sonic Couture's Glassworks instrument inside Contact, which is extremely expressive, and it is a wonderful sampled instrument made from an instrument made in the 1950s, I think, which is called Le Cristal by Bachet. And it's an instrument that has horizontal glass rods that are connected to metal sheets that vibrate. And so you play it with wet hands, and by moving over those horizontal rods, you create vibrations that will be amplified by the metal sheets and fill the room. I'd like to hear it for myself once. I've never actually heard it in real life, but actually someone was there yesterday who actually heard it for real. And he said it's totally amazing because you don't know where the sound is coming from. It's like everything is vibrating. So, but this is a tiny approximation of it, I suppose. And I'll try to play Philip Glass's Koyanis Katsi on this. Oh yeah, so I've got pitch, vibrato on each key, and some little bit of filtering going on. It's a high pass filter that provides some scraping sounds, and that to me give that little element of chaos that I like in music that feels natural. Which is, I will never be able to control how my finger falls exactly each time. I will always be a little bit off. And this is what makes music breathe, because as I move around while I'm playing, just as you, when I see you playing, you're caressing, and your gestures actually direct the sounds that are coming out. As your body is moving, you will create a different kind of chaos that will be translated in very fine-grained details, but that make the sound come to life, I think. I still said something wrong here. We're still in the wrong scale here. Just shift around. Okay, this is not the demo gun, so I don't know what I did wrong. This happens when you just try stuff out on the fly. What do I do here? I think this was
sounds
Okay,
too that
I
are
don't want to
really.
monopolize the things.
No, that's fine.
No,
So this is one thing that actually it's interesting because when I knew that we were coming out here, all of a sudden started to panic because I'm not using the Eigenharp actually in the most expressive way. So I personally, I've got this frustration. I always wanted to play the piano, but I never actually enjoyed putting my hands like that. So one of the things that I like doing the most on the Eigenharp is playing the piano, but I'm not really good at it, so I'm not going to demo that. So I didn't spend a lot of time in this first year of instrument in trying to make interesting sounds. I'll try to get some of these still across. So one other thing that I actually experimented with a couple of weeks ago was like what I said before, is that I can use these to actually work as strings on guitar, just as I was using it for bowing the cello earlier. And then I can set this up as if it was actually a guitar.
think it's marvelous.
There are no mistakes.
What?
There are no mistakes.
There are no
You can't make a mistake.
Well, still, right? I made some last minute changes this morning and not getting used to them. I wasn't really used to them yet. So.
You
And
sound,
you
you
also
sound
did a few
great.
notes of the clarinet sound.
Yeah.
With the breath pipe, that would be
Definitely
excellent.
also. Just around here, just put myself in an easier.
Okay. Well, I have far less things in my bag. If I can try another song, how's that?
I love that song, really.
This is one that's actually it's on my website. Has anyone seen the?
Okay.
She has a question.
I just had two quick questions about it. One, just for me, I play clarinet and drums
Yeah.
and sax, and that's really neat, and I can see the smaller one being really
Yeah.
interesting to get up to. But two questions. One, can you be a sort of one-man band? Can you play drums down
Yes,
here and a sort
yes.
of?
I actually, obviously, I actually didn't want to demo this here because I thought it was a little bit out of place.
Oh,
But
no.
my main demo is like something that creates loops and
Can
stuff.
you do a
like
short
that.
piece of that?
Yeah, I can try it afterwards. Yeah, I'll do it
Okay,
afterwards.
and then my other question is, I'm not playing electronic instruments so much, and just sort of starting to really understand how you can use software to translate
Right.
to these physical things, which all of these I think are pretty incredible because DJs and you never get a sense of that performance, but these are all like physical things
Right.
that have you actually see the visual expression of it, which is really fascinating because electronic music I have a hard time adapting to because of that. Because you don't really understand how the musician is creating what they're creating. But I don't want, do you have software that goes with the instrument that
Right.
you use sound banks or samples of clarinet sounds that
Yeah.
then you
So-
sort of program the thing as you like? I don't.
Well, as you start out with it, so the software runs on the Mac for the Alpha and the Tau. For the Pico, the small one, it runs on Mac and Windows 7, but the Tau and the Alpha will have Windows support very soon. The software is called Eigenharp, and it comes with this cello model, the clarinet model, that are basically just assigned for you, and you select them, and the way that I did, this is just so you've got this key here that allows you to switch between different modes. And then you say, you just know, you have to look at a sheet and you learn by heart that this is the cello, clarinet, and this is the very basic synth sounds. Then you've got 4 plug-in slots where you can put in VSTs or audio units if you want to start experimenting with these things. And then you've got 4 sampler slots where you can actually use sound fonts that are, this is a sample format, you can slot into the Eigenharp software, and we ship a bunch of them to get you started. So there's a very nice piano sample that I'll play afterwards. And then there's some organs, a bass, synth-pad, and then a drum kit. So it's very complete when you get started. So these are people, I've seen actually users that never went beyond that, that just stuck with that because it ships also with a synthesizer called Alchemy, which is very capable. So people do a lot, which is the basic package that you get. And then, of course, if you want to go further and start crafting your sounds, as you progress through it, becomes more and more complex for yourself, of course. But this is kind of a path that you can very slowly tread on if that's what you want to do, or just stick at what's there in the standard sound set, which is by no means. So this is something that the creator John Lambert wanted to do when he set out when creating the Eigenharp. He didn't want to include any sounds that weren't useful. So you will not find huge, massive synthesizer sounds that are great when you press on one key. that you can't play polyphonically, that you certainly can't play in a band. So he wanted always to include sounds that are actually useful for playing musical pieces with. So you will find out when you get the instrument that you can actually
And it's also true that while the new synthesized sounds are very compelling, we have this wonderful history with sounds that they pull our heartstrings, as we've heard music performed by these wonderful acoustic instruments. And the other thing too is there's been this Darwinism of musical instruments, and there's certain ones that have survived and certain that haven't, and they've often survived for reasons of beautiful tone. Max Matthews used to say that there are very few timbres that are truly delightful or compelling, and it's hard to create good timbres. They require complexity, they require variation, and I think it is true.
This is what I found when I started. So I said that I kind of constrained myself to learning the Eigenharp at this point with piano sound, because each time that I started venturing into trying to find a synthesized sound, I always found that I was lacking something. Because I kept crafting it and never could actually find. There's this aspect of those sounds that we like, which has the right amount of attack, it's got the right amount of sustain, it's got these combinations that allows you to if you play synth pad, that's it, you play synth pad. If all of a sudden you feel like giving some impulse that can create some more percussive or attack-like sound, it's impossible. While on the guitar you're able to do that, even on wind instruments, as you create with certain harmonics or certain blows into a saxophone, people can make it very raw, which is something you rarely find in synthesized sounds. And it's certainly possible. I think that the sample that I used here for Koyanis Cats that I just played goes into the right direction already, because I can slightly hit it and it gets that intensity across and still be very soft at times when I want it. But it's a long journey to finding these sounds. So that's why I think these traditional sounds they shouldn't be discarded just because it's an electronic instrument.
Well, why don't you give us a little bit of that band?
Yeah, so I got to warn you, I'm getting very, very jet lagged at the moment. So I flew over 2 days ago from Belgium, and this is I just spent it's like.
I live here and I'm getting jet lagged.
We spent a night without sleep at the moment for me, right? This is what it feels like. So what I'm doing here is is a rearrangement of a theme from Battlestar Galactica, which is All Along the Watchtower, rearranged by what's it called again? Brian Greery? Yeah. So I'm playing piano sounds, and I've got this very standard Yamaha sustain pedal that is plugged into. So the Eigenharp goes out through this cable, which actually carries all the information, and that's what you will use on stage. Last thing about it is that it's really been designed to be used on stage. So a lot of testing against interference.
So you can play this song.
No. And this goes on into this bass station, and it allows me to give piano sustain, right? Just so that you don't wonder where the sustain comes from. Okay.
I have a more technical question. Between all three of your instruments, you're talking a lot about pressure, and I'm wondering, just because I'm a numbers kind of person, what kind of pressure values are you talking about, and then what are the usable, typical parts of that? For example, David, your style, or Roger, your style, or your name. I mean, yeah. What are the resolutions that your instruments are kind of achieving or actually hitting in the realm of pressure, of course?
So everything, any sensor that sends out data on the Eigenharp is 10-bit, and then 2 kilohertz data stream.
So 1,024 levels.
How's that translate to PSI? Pounds per square inch or
Is it
kilopascal?
exponential?
No idea.
Yeah, I don't know.
But I'll tell you this, these pieces are so sensitive, you
It's
can blow on
totally,
them,
yeah.
and you
So
can get them to basically.
Yeah,
as I showed you earlier, you can just basically do this and have the cello kick off, or go from. But this is a playing style that I personally don't feel attached to. But some people, like Ed yesterday on the Continuum, bringing up sounds from nothing. It's totally possible to gradually start bringing up sounds. I mean, maybe the synth pad allows. So you can hear there are no steps, and it goes really from almost nothing. Just so the resolution is enough so that you never actually notice it.
I think 10 bits is a good number to use. I think 8 is too low. On my particular one, it's really not sensitive enough to the very light touch. Nothing like on this instrument, or certainly not like on David's. But I'm able to play it, adapt to it, and afterwards when you come up, you'll be able to feel and see how it actually works. Well, you have felt it before, because you've been in my house too, but you can feel it again. And what would you think that is?
Well, you know, I just bought myself a very accurate scale, and I wish I do. And I'm actually trying to see how many bits I can get, but I don't think that I'm able to get more than about 8 bits out of my own body for some reason. I haven't done enough yet, but let me say something. It's not just the pressure. When I have my finger here, if I have a very small area and I can apply, like with the tip of my nail, I have to apply a lot more force because it's in some sense integrated spatially. And one way you can kind of get at pressure with things like iPhones or iPads is to somehow get the area. But we don't think that's going to work enough. But so what you end up with this type of surface is an amalgam of area and actual pressure measurement. So it's a little tricky. There's a paper in which we actually made measurements here with a force hammer to see if we could calibrate the instrument. So that's one thing. Now, one thing that seems very important is the function that maps my gesture, the value I get to the actual intensity. And so in my patch, I've got a place I can try lots of different functions. Now, in the synth days with velocity, people thought a lot about the velocity curves and so on. So it's the analogous thing. And right now I'm using it so I can play, I really like to play very softly. And of course I've got a lot of but I have to admit that on my thunder that I have done, I still feel I can have a very, very fine, small touch and have, I think it's something we have to work on more. Now, we've been playing here with fabric sensors, and the advantage that the fabric sensor has is that you can construct a kind of sandwich that has some kind of resiliency to it, and sort of feel it. Now, my understanding of how the Eigenharp works is those are like little joysticks in some sense.
You've got light sensors underneath, actually.
Underneath, they have light sensors underneath, yeah. But you don't have this area issue that you have in these surfaces that Roger and I are talking about. So it's complicated. Yeah.
Well, I'm just thinking about Manfred Klein's did a lot of
Yeah.
there are a couple of papers I
Oh, I
remember
know.
where he went into great detail about this very area of stuff in a
Yeah.
very eccentric way.
Oh, no, I know. Well, you had this,
Semantics or
Yeah,
semantics, yeah.
yeah.
But still, I mean, he was dealing with this even in the late 60s
Oh,
and
sure,
70s.
sure.
And I think it's the real stuff. I think,
Oh, yeah, no, I
you know,
think those, the early stuff he did with the
Well, just the expression, the ability to detect emotion by
Centix, yeah.
Centix, that's it,
Yeah,
yeah.
Centix,
But there's one technical paper where he talked about these issues of that curve
yeah, well,
and the
see,
area relation to the actual
yeah,
integration of the amount of
Right,
force and all
right.
that kind of stuff.
you know, his sensor actually worked in pressure and then back and forth.
Right.
That was, and I actually had a chance to use it in the early days. I met him in '76 or so, and oh, '74 actually, and showed it. It was a very interesting story. I wish I won't. Manfred was just here the other day, and he's still going,
Anyway,
No, but I know.
I think there's a kind of an area
Oh,
that's
yeah.
kind of been
Yeah.
under investigated.
And of course, I have some sort of tactile reference here. I can feel edges on things. And I think that those are issues. I mean, ideally, we'd like to have a surface whose texture could change as a function, and that you could have ridges and so on.
Haptic sort of.
Yeah, some kind of haptic, and that would be very, I think, very useful, very interesting. There are, surprisingly, when you look at Apple's patent portfolio, they've already sort of staked that territory out. They not get ridges on surfaces and so on. I was rather shocked.
I saw a story earlier about how the Tesco company was bought up by Amazon and shut down. Well, 2 or 3 years earlier than that, there was a company called Fingerworks that had a multi-test tablet called Digest. Was that?
I have their keyboard.
Yeah.
Yes. And Apple bought them and shut them down.
Yeah.
So it's, we're all just food for worms for these larger companies while they're trying to make a better tablet computer. So, questions? Yeah.
I was wondering if you could explain the speakers a little more.
A little bit
It seems like the sound, can it travel around them?
Yes,
Just felt like it was like moving.
I could run a demo of that if you like.
Sure.
Why don't I, no, this is all research, so if it crashes, I'm warning you all.
We might have to blow it up.
40 watts times 120,
No.
what do you think?
We, so what I'm gonna, this is the first thing I'll play is a piece that involves the sounds of triangles. And the reason we did it was done by Ed Campbell, one of our composers, was that for a long time we were working hard on trying to make the small sphere work for the whole, well, down to, we've kind of given up on that now, we need a full range system, but this is a little triangle piece, and I think you might experience things differently. And what's going to happen here is the beams are going to move all over the place. They're going to be flying all over the place. So let me just
Why did you choose the triangles for a sound?
Edmund did all that. What?
Why did he choose triangles?
Well, because he did a large orchestra piece with lots of triangle sounds in it. In fact, he spent a lot. And then the nice thing with the triangles is you can build models of them using the resonant synthesis tools that Adrian.
But I guess part of it is also that it's easy to tell the directional
And then they have
source.
a nice attack.
They have a nice attack, yeah.
Yes. And, okay, so let's see, I think I'll be able to pull this off. And again, all right, there's that. Let me make sure you can see these flying around. Alright. that realization too, yeah.
It just reminds me a lot of going to the audience and
Oh,
how you've
yeah.
got all the speakers
Sure,
everywhere, but
sure.
you're still managing, it's right there, but it's amazing how it's like flicking sound all backwards.
Yeah, well, it's
You
interacting
You
with the
perceived
room.
it from being behind you?
Yeah, I mean, it was throwing with it being the shape, I don't know I'm not.
I was next to it, I could have
was
sworn
feeling
there's
it
some
like throwing
magnet.
behind
Yeah.
me, I saw it, well, it was moving around, but it was like there were many
Yeah,
speakers
that's probably
around.
it.
It's
Yeah,
really
they were-
powerful that way. to the
And of course, this plays with the room
audience.
in a very, very rich way, as do normal instruments, I mean, traditional instruments.
And speaker.
And speaker, well,
I mean,
the
Mary
speakers
Ann
were-
Emershade
yeah,
used to really use that, you know,
Yeah.
yeah.
but, so that helped, and then, of course, I don't know, I have a Leslie simulation, which is, the Leslie speaker was used with the Hammond B3 organ, and actually, that speaker was on an arm that rotated inside of this box. And so you got this kind of Doppler shift, frequency change. Let me just see if, I haven't done this one in a while. Let's see. Demos, compose, effects.
So when you're playing on your pad, can you choose which speaker you want that sound to come out of, or can you move and
Well, yeah,
try to
well,
understand how they speak?
okay. The thing I did before when I was playing,
Yeah,
which I can go back to in a moment, I had 8 beams. They weren't moving.
okay.
And I had 8 sources here, and I just mapped them to the,
Okay.
in a normal context, I would have put them out of separate
Oh,
loudspeakers,
I see.
8 separate loudspeakers. But
Part of the answer I would say is that you can use spherical panning in the terms that you can specify a position in azimuth is the term, and then elevation is another one. So you can basically pinpoint any spot on that on the sphere and then point the sound out that way. And the speakers around it will play a little bit too, and it's shaping that and making it come in a certain direction.
So is this different than Gerson's thing, or is it that same ambisonic?
no,
It's 'cause-
different, it's different.
Yeah, yeah.
But,
So that's still spherical harmonics, though. isn't it?
well, yeah, there's a,
There's a
Yeah,
difference.
no,
Okay.
no, no,
Well, let's not get too technical.
we could,
Yeah.
we could
that's
go.
all right. Yeah.
One of the problems with ambisonics is that you're kind of religious.
Yeah, that's true.
We're not religious here.
No, I just was wondering, if it was, you know, part of the same thing.
Okay. Well, yeah, it is. Put it that way. So,
A quick question while he's looking for that. Do you have to have computers on stage when you perform with these instruments, or?
well, that's a good question.
I don't see one with Roger, but classically,
Oh,
if we're
it's
talking
right
about
here.
simulating. Oh, okay. Oh, yes. Sorry, because that to me, like, it takes away so much of the
Yes.
magic.
And in fact, if I weren't just cramped here,
Right.
and when I actually perform, I really prefer to have the computer out of view.
Right.
You know, so it's not, it's just something part of the.
But
Right, but I
in
don't-
each case, the sound is being generated by the computer,
I see.
and what you're seeing us playing is merely sending control signals to the computer for
I see.
generation. And it really is, it's the easiest way, considering that these things are not generally huge sellers, it's the easiest way to be able to use the sophisticated software tools that are with these mature operating systems, as opposed to writing it on little chips inside your.
But I think it's also the smartest way towards the
Yeah.
users, because technology changes so quickly, and there's this example of Steinberg that just a couple of months ago introduced VST 3.5 with note expression, which allows now finally not to have to use MIDI and to have these plugins that have individual controls per note instead of per channel. This is a change that appeared a couple of months ago. Imagine that these DSP things would be running on a box built in. You would be kind of stuck, right? You would
Yeah,
not
that's
be able
true.
to take advantage of that. Things are advancing so rapidly, and it's actually the smart move to kind of take the brain outside of the box and be able to switch them out. And as computers grow faster, be able to do more with it and keep your same instrument, which you spend so long mastering and learning the muscle memory for, keep that and switch that part out. So on the other hand, me, as a guitar player, I gig quite a lot, and I kind of threw out all amps, and I'm just gigging with one computer. And I find it's actually great, because I never have anything unexpected, and I don't have wires that just, you know, pull out and stuff like that. So
And a way to think, to maybe accept the thinking is an analogy to, if you think of a church organ with all the pipes all around the building, and the controller is the keyboard, and why isn't the sound coming from the keyboard in a little box? Well, if you want all those different sounds, you connect to all the sound generators in the cathedral to create all the different sounds. And it's kind of like the controller and the sound generator is separate.
If it were not for that, the instruments would all have to be significantly more expensive, because it takes quite a lot of computing power to do some of this very sophisticated sounds in the Eigenharp, and certainly talking about 800 oscillators. It's very, very computer intensive, so it's best to be able to use the power of the computer to reduce the cost of the instrument and focus some of that on software. And so I suspect once some of these instruments really start to become popular in the culture, then maybe, and small computers are very fast, then it will move into the body of the instrument. For example, it might be that the Eigenharp might have a slot in it for 5 years from now, an iPod Touch that has 100 times the power and can do that, and then you can be completely portable. But really, to the musician who's really interested in these new sounds and these new control aspects, it really isn't a big issue.
No, I understand.
It's pretty simple.
It's more the light.
Pardon?
It's more the light.
But what I actually do is, when I play on stage, I've got a rack mount computer that just sits in my audio rack, and no one actually realizes that it's a computer. And I just, I control it with my iPad, and it just connects to Wi-Fi. I turn it off, and no one realizes that it's.
Well, that was the other question. Do you need to reference the computer while you're performing? No,
No,
you
so
have
you've
pads,
never seen you touch it, right?
Right.
So something that you can do though is just use, in this case, with our software, we've got a control surface that allows you to change the aspects of all the instruments and the mixer channels over Wi-Fi on the iPad. And this is an app where you can actually make your own layouts on the computer, and then have a version run on the iPad, have all the layouts running on the iPhone, and control stuff like that. But I personally only use that when I'm setting up stuff, and then when I'm actually playing, I just use the instruments and I never touch the computer.
I mean, I guess it's not so much that it's the computer, but it's also the concept of like these new instruments that are electronic. And so you're retraining people to think of this new thing, this physical thing, as having this very musical touch. And you can see that in the way all of you perform with them. But computer music often has this particular kind of reputation, right? And so it's so neat to see it in a different physical form, as opposed to somebody who's just tapping on the keyboard. And so it'd be I feel like for the regular observer, it's so much sexier to see it without the computer, so that you can really understand it. It's like, wow, this is an electrical sort of digital thing, but it's very much this classical feel. Even the ones that you two are playing with your hands, you still like, when you see a musician play, there's a body rhythm that they envelop when they're...
That's one of the beauties of this instrument.
Right, but I mean, I felt like all of them involved that. And watching you dance, David, while you were playing yours, it was like, I really was moved by it. And yours has very computer-like sounds, as opposed to this, which can sound or yours, it sounds very much like a guitar. And to enjoy those sort of digital sounds that you almost have a bit, you can almost hear that. It's so unusual in electronic music to have that kind of feel with it. So
It's a many-faceted discussion.
Yeah,
and the beauty of it is that we're stimulating that debate here in events like this.
Right, it's cool. It's
But
great.
the strange thing is that there are, I think the band where your son plays in, they use also guitars, so amp simulators, as I do on stage, but to make it accepted, they just put empty speakers on stage, so the people think the sound comes from the speakers, but it's actually a computer.
Right.
It's actually ridiculous, isn't it?
It's basically where you put the computer.
Right.
Almost, half of the bands use computers on stage now.
Yeah, it's very
or
true.
several.
It's very true.
So,
I'd like to suggest that,
I think it's time for wine.
well, I was going to suggest that,
you're
but I mean, there are so many different curiosities people have. Why don't we, if everyone is open to this, just move it up to coming up for the hands-on portion of the evening, and you can ask your individual questions and try the instruments out. So at this point, let's end the formalized portion of it, if that's okay. And I'd like to thank David, and I'd like to thank Derek for being here.
You're welcome.